Thank you again to Capcom and 47PR for the review codes. Apologies for shifting aspect ratios due to monitor changes mid-recording. On with the video! Let's get this out of the way. If you already love the remake, you're gonna love this DLC. Probably already bought it too. This video isn't about giving a simple yay or nay on it, but instead digging into what's going on in Capcom's latest remake. It might help you understand why you like it, or if you're like me, why it leaves you wanting. After my original review earlier this year, I fully intended to do just a more traditional re-review of the PC port. Except something unexpected arose when I could finally use my preferred control scheme. I was slightly bored, and that lack of deep feeling bugged me more than the rough time I had on console because I couldn't quite nail why this time. It was like a very acceptable meal. It fulfilled the basic needs, but it didn't push any dials in a way that I really was expecting it to. But still, it's not a bad game. When I gave it a 7 out of 10, I wasn't trying to be brutal or anything either. It's, a reasonably entertaining time. I don't begrudge anyone for enjoying it. As we dug into in the last video, it's not like Resident Evil 4 Remake lacks the mechanics I'd look for in a Resident Evil title. It's arguably a combination of two of my favorite entries. Yet there's something off about it that Separate Ways brilliantly highlighted by basically just being the main game, but shorter. I'm not kidding, every chapter is essentially a microcosm of several Leon goes through, not simply in terms of reused assets, but also the mechanical themes underlying them. Ada Wong's journey parallels Leon in a more efficient, higher difficulty manner. And I do appreciate that they have a higher skill ceiling expected from you going into this, except now there's much less filler in the way to just sort of numb you. It's nothing but the meat and bone to chew on, and when you get down to it, it's just not that excited to be here most of the time. Like, there's an energy, but it's much more performative. Like I mentioned in my original review, there's a distinct absence of the kind of weird Evil Dead-esque joy, and instead a more perfunctory seriousness. Everything is precisely what you'd expect. Rarely is it distinctly subverted. That presentation style is all the more evident whenever Separate Ways tries to integrate cut ideas from the main campaign of the original game into its own storyline, resulting in over-the-top moments that feel oddly deflated due to how stern Ada is. She's dancing through a web of lasers, and it doesn't feel like either a desperate struggle or showing off, more like she's doing paperwork and annoyed. Again, I don't blame Capcom for making the choice for their broader audience, and clearly it's working for them using this tone. As a creator, I totally get it. That doesn't make the reality any more spicy though, because I played Separate Ways. It's only 5 hours long, which to be fair is an incredible bargain of content for $10 as an add-on for any AAA game, but it honestly felt longer. There were points where I listened to video essays whenever dialogue wasn't being exchanged. A dire sign given I almost never do this when reviewing anything, even games with minimal story. There's nothing here to tip the scales if you were underwhelmed the first go-round. This isn't some rare DLC where suddenly the experience clicks differently. If anything, it demonstrates how jarringly swift some sections of the campaign force you down a certain path to meet expectations, even if you're not done exploring. There's a far more controlling grip on your shoulder here as opposed to the original game, and even some of the games that Resident Evil 4 inspired. Like, the first Evil Within might be linear to a fault, but you're at least typically fairly certain where you would have to go to trigger a cutscene or be locked into an arena so that you can scavenge appropriately beforehand. Perhaps this more abrupt style in Separate Ways and Remake is an attempt to catch players off guard, but it's not that pleasant a way to do it, and there's usually a cleverness to it, because horror games, as unusual as a parallel as it is to give, is kinda like kink. Boundaries are set, rules are applied, and safe words at the ready to stop everything if you're not feeling it. Remake kinda struggles with this at points, Separate Ways doubly so. Perhaps the most egregious moment is the additional stage with Saddler before he fights Leon. It's not only wholly unnecessary for the plot, it's just not all that polished. Saddler lacks animations and sound effects for being damaged by your weapons, at least until you have him in a critical state. Not even a slight shift to his body when an explosive arrow hits him right in the face. It's bizarre, it's frustratingly hard to read, and it's one of the few unique encounters to the DLC, but it does need to be there out of expectation and obligation in terms of how you pace things out. Because originally, Ada fought Krauser, a repeat fight that Separate Ways now hints like it's leading towards, but completely excises. And any Resident Evil campaign needs its big boss fight, even though the main game already provided its own. This is all the more unfortunate as the far better race against time that serves as the true finale to Separate Ways is wonderfully adapted here and far better tests your skills that you've honed as Ada over the course of her campaign. It's a very awkward situation. You're supposed to have this fight where a guy mutates and has an eyeball pop out of somewhere because it's Resident Evil, and we had a fight here before, and we don't want to have a Resident Evil 3 situation where there's not a clock tower. Even though it actually would have been stronger and flowed more elegantly if Ada's interruption had purely been a cutscene and we would have just moved on. So we've got a game that's overly controlling of not only its players, but even its developers through what needs to happen. While I personally find that prospect dreadful, there is the reality that a lot of people who play games like to be directed like this. They want to be told what to do. They go deer in headlights at a friggin' Telltale game. And they aren't worried about what essayists are saying. They want the controller in their hand and to be directed to feel a certain set of emotions they presume their media will give them. And it's because of that expectation and presumption of what they will experience that further hammers home why things flow in that specific forced manner. I've seen this impacting people's ability to dive back into not only this remake, but even things like Dead Space Remake. Both games have made the barrier to experience the vast majority of their content exceptionally minimal, which isn't a bad thing in of itself, but they're also prioritized for that first playthrough, for giving tons of gratification on that initial run rather than expecting repeated runs. For crying out loud, I unlocked the entire Mercenary Mode's content in under 3 hours of playing after not touching the game for months and was able to nail an S++ rating on the hardest map. None of this has to do with being remakes either, which I've seen used as the main reason to knock Resident Evil 4 Remake. No, that's not it. Remakes are fine. They're just being done a lot of right now, and whenever something becomes a trend, people are going to assume that that trend is the source of everything that they don't like in that medium they might otherwise dig. Believe me, I get it. I'm so freaking tired of hearing about Battle Royales. But that doesn't mean that Fortnite's a bad game, it's just not my cup of tea. The divisive aspects of Resident Evil 4 Remake would be divisive whether or not it was a remake. Whether it's an original writing or an update to existing dialogue, Leon is dull. This boss fight sucks. Regardless, there are people who are going to prefer one way or the other, and that's fine, but we need to think about why these creative decisions are being made. The question isn't whether Separate Ways is worth it on its own merits, but entirely whether you already dug what Capcom's dishing out. Everything else here is mute. All critics of it, like myself, can hope is that whatever comes next is a bit more like Resident Evil 3. And you know what? I keep talking about it so much, it's time to give Resident Evil 3 its due.
Hey, I told you I couldn't leave you in a Carlos's world. That would just be too cruel.
See you next time.